The Chicago Bears used their mini bye week before week 7 to evaluate their own team. And now they're left with a few big lingering questions they need to answer before the regular season finishes.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. Today's episode is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with our promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. On the show today, we look at the big questions the Bears still need to answer as this regular season goes on. And it's a little bit bigger or wider than just the Justin Fields evaluation, right? Evaluating how good Justin Fields is and what he will bring for the future of your franchise is an ongoing process that won't necessarily be fully answered by the end of this regular season. So I want to sort of dive in beyond that. That's sort of the obvious of, yes, that's always being looked at. But I want to look at this Bears offensive line and what kind of questions we can answer about that group and what this roster might look like moving towards the future. Some guys on one-year contracts or on the last year of their contracts, and some guys that might want some big money that still need to figure out what they're worth and who belongs and who doesn't belong with this team next year and beyond. For me, a big one starts on the offensive line, and I think the Bears still need to figure out how many new starters will they need on the offensive line next year. You know, how many offensive linemen will they need to upgrade or replace this offseason? Because we knew it was supposed to be a big priority this offseason. And funny enough, when you really think about it, when this offensive line was healthy, they had one new starter on the offensive line, Braxton Jones at left tackle. But otherwise, it was guys at different positions, but 4 of the same guys from last year in Cody Whitehair, Sam Mustipher, Tevin Jenkins, and Larry Borum. Now with injuries and moving things around, there's obviously been some slight changes to that. I mean, mainly with Whitehair gone and reports of Mustipher's time running out at center. So yes, but it's interesting how that works, right? They didn't end up overhauling that position in the starting lineup as drastically as we might have thought. But now Ryan Poles has this season to really see these guys that he inherited, plus Braxton Jones that he drafted, and figure out, okay, are these young guys long-term answers on this offensive line, or do they need to be upgraded? You know, will their development track on a path that will make them above average quality offensive linemen to give Justin Fields more of a fighting chance next season? Or do you have to go drastic in terms of overhauling that group the way Poles and the Chiefs front office did a couple of years ago? When you look at the offensive line as we know it so far, I think it's pretty clear based on what the play that Tevin Jenkins looks like a future offensive line starter for your team. Presumably at right guard, where he's playing now and playing at a pretty high level, but maybe he could eventually be back at right tackle. But if right now it's not broken, don't fix it, right? But he looks to me like a clear-cut, like, yes, Tevin Jenkins belongs as one of your starting offensive linemen next season. Presumably at right guard, but I'm not as focused on like positions, but more just like, do you have 5 guys that you trust as starters, or how many new starters do you need to go after? Because like I think right now, Larry Borum and Braxton Jones are both still to be determined, right? Through the first 6 games, they've had some rough moments, right? But it hasn't been so terrible, like, oh my God, these guys are never going to figure it out. Get them on the bench and get them out of here. They're busts that are just never going to be good offensive linemen, right? They're young players with some upside and some athletic ability that you need to see progress. You need to see growth. You need to see those steps forward. There needs to be improvement. But if there is that improvement over the course of the remainder of the season, they could very well be your 2 starting tackles next year if they continue to play well and grow. If they don't, or if one does, I mean, that's when you start to wonder, do you just need to go get a clearly better option there? And maybe a clearly better option just presents itself and you're willing to just put a 5th round pick on the bench and say, sorry, we got a much better player, with that 1st round draft pick or whatever, or in free agency, whatever kind of presents itself. I don't think neither Borum nor Jones, demands to be starting, but there's still a chance that as the season goes on, as they improve and develop, that they could look more and more like guys who belong as starting caliber tackles next season that won't be liabilities on your offensive line. Lucas Patrick at this point needs to turn things around. So, it's not, if the season ended right now, I would say no, he hasn't played like a guy who belongs as a starter on your offensive line next year. But we've seen him play at a higher level than this previously in his career. And so I think there is still time, that if he does indeed move back to center and settles in there and gets back to the level of play we saw last year in Green Bay, he could be a player that belongs in your starting lineup. He has not been one so far and needs a very significant turnaround from what we've seen. So the jury's not out, in the same way that I think we kind of know Sam Mustipher is not playing like a guy who needs to be in your starting lineup next year. Doesn't mean you cut him, doesn't mean you cast him off the team, but he's a backup caliber player right now. And you could keep developing him, and maybe over time he could grow and get better and work his way into a starting role someday. But that's a pretty more clear no. We kind of know what he is right now, and it's going to take more time than just these last 10 games to really settle that out. The other one that's interesting here is Alex Leatherwood, the former 1st round pick that they brought in from the Raiders, who hasn't played at all. He's the kind of guy who has the talent, certainly coming out of college, to be a starting caliber offensive lineman. And I'm curious if the Bears make an effort to put him on the field to evaluate and see, is he a guy that we could trust as a starter? I don't know exactly where that would be, because, do you bench Borum or Jones to play him at tackle? Do you bench, do you put him at left guard when he's healthy, even though he hasn't really played left guard? I mean, it's a little bit tricky there, but I think I would be interested to see what he could do, but not at the expense of taking a good offensive lineman off the field and putting a bad one out there. But to sort of summarize, right now, we've got one for sure offensive lineman, Tevin Jenkins, that he should be a starter again next year. Roll with him as one of them. You got 2 maybes at the offensive tackle spots, and then Lucas Patrick is a longer shot, but a dark horse potential. And then of course, Cody Whitehair coming off of injury, right? I sort of left him out because we kind of knew that he's reliable, but he's got that big contract. So we'll see if the Bears are willing to keep paying him at that rate or not. But I think when he's on the team, yes, he's also one of them. So I think you got 2 for sure starters, 2 maybes, and 1 we'll see, but probably going to replace at least 1 total starter this upcoming offseason based on what we've seen so far, and maybe as many as 2 or 3, depending on how the rest of this season goes. Answering that question is going to help answer the bigger Justin Fields question, but I think there's a bigger question to be asked about all of the new players brought in, especially the free agents, and who belongs. Who's a long-term piece and who are they just going to say, yeah, 1 year was enough and don't need to see any more. We'll kind of go through that free agent class and look at what we know and what we still need to see over these last 10 games next on Locked On Bears. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Prediction Strike, the world's first sports stock market. These guys are really cool. I'm really excited about this product. You can now invest in professional athletes just like the stock market. It's a lower risk alternative to sports betting, and athlete prices move based on not only their performance, but also supply and demand. You look back, if you had invested in Jalen Hurts 1 year ago, that stock is up almost 50% year over year. Rashad Penny is up 154%, whereas Kyle Pitts, Atlanta Falcons, his stock's down 44% after his slow start to this season. And there's a ton of other options to look at, not just NFL players, but also they've got NBA, MLB, and UFC. And what's different about this versus other types of like fantasy or whatever is the athletes actually benefit from this too. They're entitled to a percentage of their market cap, unlike, other sports betting where they're not in on it at all. Athletes get some of the money from this stock trading, and there's only 2.5% trade fees is the lowest in real money sports. So download the Prediction Strike app, Prediction Strike, and use our code LOCKED for a free share when you sign up and make a first deposit of $20 or more. That's promo code LOCKED for a special one-time giveaway. Prediction Strike will choose one person who signs up with the code LOCKED and makes a deposit to win 100 free random shares. So everybody gets one. One random winner will also get 100 more. That could be worth up to $3,000 if you get lucky and receive, say, Josh Allen shares. Invest in what you know on Prediction Strike, the stock market for sports. Whether you're looking to pop the question or have a milestone to celebrate or just want to let your love sparkle, our friends at BlueNile can help you make your celebrations even more memorable. As the original online jeweler, BlueNile offers the largest selection of independently graded diamonds and pieces priced significantly below traditional retailers. BlueNile has helped millions of couples create their perfect engagement ring. They've got an easy online tool that lets you choose the diamond shape, the size, and clarity, as well as the setting style. And BlueNile's bench jewelers will then help you handcraft her perfect, one-of-a-kind engagement ring. If you're having trouble choosing, BlueNile has jewelry experts on hand 24/7. So shop stress-free with BlueNile's 100% satisfaction guarantee. Make your moment sparkle with BlueNile. Go to BlueNile.com and use our promo code LOCKEDON to save $50 on your purchase of $500 or more. That's BlueNile.com, code LOCKEDON to save $50 on your purchase of $500 or more. BlueNile.com, code LOCKEDON. So besides figuring out this offensive line, which is perhaps the most important of the groups in flux, especially when it comes to Justin Fields, I think they've really got to figure out, of all these new guys that Ryan Poles is evaluating, who belongs and who doesn't, right? Because as important as the offensive line is, you also think like wide receiver, right? You got to figure out who besides Darnell Mooney. You still have to answer who besides Darnell Mooney, belongs on this team. But I think it can really expand out to all the free agents in particular, because every contract that Ryan Poles signed this offseason for a free agent was a 1-year deal or a 2-year deal. And most of those 2-year deals have it easy for the Bears to get out of the contract after 1 year. It's almost like a team option in that second year. So none of these guys are really like surefire guaranteed to be on this roster next season. None of these free agents that the Bears signed, and many of them are just on those 1-year deals. And we've talked about this a little bit in previous weeks about how some of the new pieces are fitting in here, but it's not an encouraging start to the first 6 games, but that doesn't mean the next 10 can't turn things around. Because, of course, it's going to be a slower start for brand new players brought in playing a brand new system and getting used to a brand new quarterback and all that stuff. So we can have some patience, but we do need to answer these questions over the next 10 games. Like, for example, really need to get Byron Pringle back from injury and see, like, can he be a number 2, number 3 receiver? Like, he was kind of the big weapon addition that just hasn't been available to the team. And you'd really like to kind of get an answer after this season of like, hey, is he any good or is he not? Like, can he be a fit? Is he a guy that you would want to bring back next season? Because again, if this season ended today, we just haven't seen him. Like, so there's not really any reason yet to, certainly not to bring him back at the same salary, like sure, a minimum deal or whatever, to still give him another chance to see what he could do. But like at some point before this season is over, it'd be nice to get him back off the injured reserve and see what he can do in this Bears offense. Because otherwise you just don't know. Or like Justin Jones, right, on the defensive line, defensive tackle, one of the 2-year deal players. So far, he's not playing like a prized 3-technique interior pass rusher that's so important to this defense. He's made a couple of flash plays here and there, but it just hasn't been consistent enough interior pass rush. And I think his cap hit next year is supposed to rise up to like $7 million, and the Bears can get out of it pretty easily. And he hasn't looked like a guy that's like, yeah, definitely bring him back and lock him into the starting lineup because he's just been so good. Like, it hasn't happened. And there's still time for him to have a better second half of the season and give you some more faith in him as a long-term option as an interior pass rusher. But through the first 6 games, just haven't really seen enough of that just yet. kind of feel the same way about Al-Qadim Muhammad next to him on the defensive line, one of the other 2-year deals here. But we know Matt Eberflus brought him over from the Indianapolis Colts, right? We know there's sort of that connection with Alan Williams and the whole defensive staff. So it doesn't seem to me that Al-Qadim Muhammad has played up to a level that you want to bring him back and make him a starter, in your defensive line. But there may be additional factors in terms of player and coach relationship that could ultimately play into what his future holds with the Chicago Bears. Kind of a similar thing on offense with Lucas Patrick. I mean, we already talked about him, so we don't need to go into it too much, but he's got to get better, but he's got the Luke Getsy connection, and the Bears seem to still be very big fans of what Lucas Patrick can do, despite some of the poor play that we've seen. So certainly if he gets better, then he can be a guy who can be next year starter on the offensive line and be a piece that you can work with there. But if he doesn't, would they move on from him, or is the Luke Getsy loyalty there too strong? I mean, I'd take him on as a backup with versatility, who could play guard and center, and if you need him to start in a spot. But I would like to, ideally, I think, upgrade over him at the offensive line. But if you need to, you need to. So, both of those guys are kind of hard to piece through. The only other guy who signed a 2-year deal was Trevor Siemian as the backup quarterback. And, I mean, hopefully we don't see Trevor Siemian at all season, and he can just come back as the backup again next year, and hopefully you don't have to see him at all next year either, right? That's the best backup quarterback can just never be on the field. That would be absolutely ideal. Those are your 4 2-year deals, the only guys that are under contract to return in 2023 among this Ryan Poles free agent class. Justin Jones, Al-Qadim Muhammad, Lucas Patrick, Trevor Siemian. Everybody else, 1-year deal. Have you showed us enough this season to come back on another contract, or are they just going to let him walk? I think Nick Morrow is a tough one to answer there, because I think the Nick Morrow we've seen in Chicago is largely the Nick Morrow we saw in Las Vegas, and we've seen throughout his career. He's athletic, he's fast, not very physical, gonna get washed out on blocks, isn't always elite in coverage, but is a good athlete and has some instincts there. So it's kind of the same Nick Morrow, where it's I would like to have better at linebacker. You would like to upgrade that spot, but if you have a good defense around him, you can do worse. You can live. If Nick Morrow is your worst defensive starter, you're in a very good place, right? So he's not a must upgrade from, but in an ideal world, you can do better. So I'm not giving Nick Morrow any kind of bigger contract than he got this season, but if I could just copy and paste, sign him again to the same 1-year deal, give him another shot at it, I'm not horribly opposed to it. Certainly it might depend on what happens with the other linebacker, who we'll talk about here in just a moment. That's spoiler alert to what the last big question is going to be. But wide receivers, right? Think Dante Pettis. He could still turn it on later in the season. None of these guys I want to fully write off and say no, they're terrible and they're never going to be good. But Dante Pettis hasn't struck you as a guy that's gotta bring him back, right? Probably this is probably it for Dante Pettis unless things change drastically. Equanimeous St. Brown's a little closer. I would bring back Equanimeous St. Brown if he could be my number 4 or number 5 wide receiver instead of my number 2 right now. Right? I think that's kind of the difference, where I bring him back with the idea that he is much farther down the depth chart and is only playing a little bit. Sure, he's had some flashes in there, and he knows the system with Luke Getsy, that. I'm not totally against it, but certainly at a very cheap value, much like what the Bears have him on right now. Pretty much everybody else is veteran backup types, like Riley Reif and Michael Schofield on the offensive line, or the backup tight ends like Ryan Griffin or they got Trevin Wesco. I mean, they're backup veterans, 1-year deals to keep them coming back that you can get out of at any time, I guess. That's about what the questions are from there. But really right now, none of the free agents have strike us as yeah, this guy is great. Bring him back. He's a long-term piece. The Bears found a gem in this free agent player. It just hasn't really taken that shape so far, but most of them are still in the camp of maybe bring them back. Certainly if it could be at the same value, but no one's yeah, give them a raise, lock them in long term. We're still figuring out what that has to be, but that's why they have 10, 11 more weeks of regular season football to see who belongs and who doesn't. I also think it's 10 or 11 more weeks to see what you have in Roquan Smith and how much you're willing to pay him. And that's the last big question that's sort of lingering too. We'll kind of look at his value and his worth and go more specifically comparing him to some of his contemporaries at linebacker in the NFL. next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks, the better way to do daily fantasy football, because there's no competing against other people in PrizePicks. You are in control. It's you versus the house. You pick 2 to 5 players, and you decide, will they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection? And you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry, not just for Bears games, which makes those a lot more fun, but NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, golf, college sports, WNBA, NASCAR, tennis, you name it, all the sports, they have them at PrizePicks. It's super easy to play. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less, and they're safe and fast withdrawals when you're ready to cash out as well. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with our promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. It's simple. Just don't forget that promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for that instant deposit match up to $100. It's hard to get a sense of how exactly or where exactly the Chicago Bears value Roquan Smith. There was clearly a rift, a gulf in that, a discrepancy in between what Roquan thought his number was and what Ryan Poles thought his number was in the preseason. And of course, they kind of agreed to just play out the year. But then Roquan struggles to start the season and has 3 or 4 games there that just weren't great and put it together against the Texans in a way that looked phenomenal. Really looked like Roquan Smith was rounding into form. And then since then, he's been good, just not great. And that delineation is important in where these contract negotiations stand, because he wants to be the highest paid or one of the highest paid players at the position. It changes the evaluation differently than it does for other players, because if you want to be paid like the best, then you need to play like the best, right? This isn't like other free agent negotiations where it's like, okay, do you give the guy $7 million or $8 million? Like, you can start to nitpick and say, okay, like, do you value the guy or not? But Roquan Smith, $20 million is the top of the linebacker market. And that's the type of range that reportedly he's been looking at. And that obviously then if he's looking at that and the Bears didn't give it to him, then they see him somewhere a little bit lower than that. And he's got these last 10, 11 games here to, really prove himself to the Bears and the rest of the NFL that, like, hey, I am a $20 million linebacker, not a $15 million linebacker. I mean, that the range of negotiations here becomes a little bit wider when you look at the linebacker market. So right now, as far as like average annual salary, which is not always the best way to measure a contract because guaranteed money plays a big role in this and how the contract is structured. But for simplicity purposes, the current contracts in terms of their per year average over the length of the deal that they've signed, there are 2 $20 million linebackers right now. Really, I think they're 19 and change, but you just round it up to $20 million because it's close enough. Shaquille Leonard from the Colts, a.k.a. Darius Leonard, but formerly known as Darius Leonard, now Shaquille Leonard, who played with Matt Eberflus, and then Fred Warner of the San Francisco 49ers. And we saw Fred Warner in week 1. Leonard's been hurt all season for the most part and hasn't really played this year, but we've seen how good he can be. Like, those players are big-time difference makers at the linebacker position. They show up, they make the biggest plays in the biggest moments. You don't see them miss the easy ones. They're not that they never make mistakes, but they're just so reliable and consistent. I mean, they'll have bad games here and there. Sure, every great player does, but like, there's a certain understanding that, like, you see Fred Warner, and he's pretty consistently the best player on the field on that defense, right? Even when they have, Bosa, you can start to argue, but like, it's not important that he's truly number one, but that when he's on the field, you know where he is and you notice his presence at all times and that he affects your offensive game plan. And I think against the Houston Texans, Roquan Smith was that. He was the best player on the field for the Chicago Bears defense. And he disrupted a lot of what the Texans wanted to do on offense. He was making plays in the running game, making a big interception at the end, right? I mean, he was that difference maker on the field. And if he was that difference maker on the field every single game, give him the $20 million, 100% on board. Pay Roquan Smith then. If he could be that guy for you in every game, that's what you pay for. Like, he needs to have that Khalil Mack-like presence where it's just like, oh, like he's all reliable. We know what we're getting on him every single game, and he makes those plays. And Fred Warner has been that for the 49ers. And Shaquille Leonard has largely been that for the Indianapolis Colts, especially as he got later in his career. And we just haven't seen enough of that from Roquan Smith, not even just this season, but in years past, right? Like, there are games and there are moments, and that's great. Like, Roquan Smith is a good linebacker, a very good linebacker. But there's a gap here between Shaquille Leonard and Fred Warner and everybody else when it comes to the contract market. So those two guys are the two $20 million linebackers. Then you've got C.J. Mosley of the New York Jets. He's making his contract's like $17 million a year per average. Then there's a drop from him to Foyesade Olukun from the Jacksonville Jaguars, who's getting $15 million a year. And then Zach Cunningham from the Tennessee Titans is at $14.5 million a year. Deion Jones is also right around there, but he got traded and was kind of a lesson of like, hey, be careful paying big money to these linebackers. They don't always hold up in terms of being really, really good. So it's like, though there's the cream of the crop are at 20, and there's a $3 million jump to 17, and then a $2 million jump to 15. And those are your top 4 highest paid linebackers. Roquan Smith wants to be one of the 20s, but he's playing more like the 15, maybe the 17, but somewhere in the 15 to 17. And all of a sudden, we're talking about a $5 million difference, right? It's not like, I think that when we would talk about like Allen Robinson and those negotiations before last season, like he wanted 18 and the Bears were around 16 was kind of the feeling, right? So like $2 million here or there, okay. I can live with an extra $2 million a year to this player or whatever, like if you really value him. But if we're at more like $5 million, that's a big deal. That's a big difference. And he needs to, if he wants those extra $5 million, like that's what it takes, right? You have to be a Fred Warner type. And I think he's playing more like the 14, 15, 16, maybe 17. You could meet in the middle somewhere there, but he wants to set the market, right? He wants to be the next highest paid linebacker because every new top player that gets the new contract goes a little higher than the last big new contract if they're the big top player at their position. But he's not. I mean, he's very good, right? If you gave him a $15 million a year contract, he would be the 4th highest paid linebacker in the NFL. That would, I don't think you would complain if you said he's the 4th best linebacker in the NFL. That's not an insult. It's not an insult to say he's, I personally, I don't think he's the 4th best linebacker in the NFL, but I would be willing to pay him like the 4th best linebacker in the NFL. But that extra $5 million a year goes a long way. And it's worth it if it's a player that's truly making a difference on every single snap. And if he can do that more consistently over the last 10 games, really settle into this defense and look like a stud, dial in, lock in, and just fire out, then either the Bears or somebody else is going to give him the $20 million a year. If he doesn't, really interested to see what that market ends up looking like. Bears probably going to franchise tag him either way and then negotiate and or trade. You're not just going to let him walk as a free agent, but that looks very messy in the future based on what we've seen so far, but there's time to answer that a little bit more as this season goes on. Those are kind of my big questions. There's always more questions across the roster, and I would love to hear yours. Let us know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, in the comments below. Tell me your unanswered questions that the Bears need to answer before this regular season is over. You can tweet us at Locked On Bears or post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group as well. Keep making Locked On Bears your first listen each and every day. Hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening or watching on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. That way you're coming back for all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Today, bringing you all the latest sports news from every sport around the sports world's podcast form. 25 minutes or less, keeps you up to date on everything going on across the sports world beyond just your Chicago Bears. Then come on back for tomorrow's podcast as we break down the Monday Night Football game against the New England Patriots, and keep coming back for that next opportunity to bear down.